Welcome to How to Replace Reaction with Response, a short little 30-minute webinar today. I also say thank you for finding me. So if you're here watching the replay for any reason, you'll see that there were two replays. The first one was just basically full of technical difficulties, and then this one is the real one. So thank you for making it here today. I'm very excited to be here, and thanks to all of you for being patient with all the technical difficulties. So today for this webinar, and the short little I like to call them strategy seminars sometimes because it's a very quick, very basic strategy that you can use to achieve something that you've been wanting to achieve in your life as a parent or a professional or just as a human being. So today I'm going to be talking about the reaction loop and the idea of how do you replace your reactions that you have with very intentional responses. So the goal here today is for you to walk away having at least one thing that you know you want to do as a parent, as a person, or as a professional that you know you want to do, but you haven't been able to do it. You don't know why you keep reacting the way you do. You know what you want to say, but you say something else. You know you want to be patient with your child, but instead you lose your temper. You know you want to eat healthy after 8 p.m., but instead you grab a bag of snacks. Whatever it is, there's something you've been doing that you know you want to do something different. And so what we're going to talk about today is really scientifically, how do you make that happen? So instead of just beating yourself up over not having enough willpower, it's all about how do you actually make it happen. So we're going to start that off now with a short little introduction. I'm going to introduce the strategy, and then we're actually going to go through some examples, and you're going to do it yourself and plan it all out. And you should have already received an email. If you're watching this, you've received an email that has a handout to go with it. If you're watching this and you never got that email, or you're watching this later as a video, I highly recommend going to www.createbalancedlife.com. Go to our resource room and you will find a ton of handouts, but you will find the reaction loop handout. That's the one you want. That's going to really help you with this webinar and with this strategy. All right, give you a minute to toggle back and forth, and then we're going to get started. All right, how to replace reaction with response. So let's talk about why you want to go to this workshop, what you're going to walk away with at the end of this video. At the end of this webinar, you're going to walk away with an understanding of cues, reactions, responses, and outcomes. So remember those four things. We're going to be coming back to them a lot. They're really the four basic components that you need to understand how to break down your reactions while you're having them and then replace them with intentional responses. We're going to go through a 4-step strategy, something you can use anytime. I'm going to really encourage you at the end of this webinar to pick one thing, just one reaction you're having that you want to replace with an intentional response. That's the goal at the end of this workshop, for you to have that strategy having gone through it once and just do it with one thing. But then in a few months, if you have something else you want to do this with, the strategy still works, even for different ideas or different responses you want to have. And again, you should have the Create Balanced strategy sheet. If you don't have it, go to createbalancedlife.com, go to the resource room or resource page, and you'll be able to find that worksheet. It's very helpful to have as you go through this. All right, so just a quick introduction. My name is Marie Levy-Papst. I'm the founder of Create Balance. I founded Create Balance to teach parents, especially working parents, systematic and practical strategies to help them create a balanced life on their own terms. I founded it in part because of my own frustrations as a working mom, especially as a teacher. I went back to work when my son was 9 months old as a teacher, a high school English teacher. And I found myself just being very, very frustrated, not so much that I couldn't do everything that needed to get done, but just feeling like I couldn't do things I wanted to do well, and feeling spread too thin, but almost more on an emotional energy level, and of course also a time level. And so I started trying to figure out what are some very practical ways to solve this problem. And that's how the Create Balance method was born. It's born out of those very practical strategies, and taking the problem of a balanced life and taking it away from guilt and societal pressures and culture, and just looking at it objectively and saying, what do I want my life to look like? What do I want to maximize my time on and minimize my time on, and how can I make that happen? And so that's a little bit of where Create Balance comes from. But one of the things I had to realize is the other side of that, and this is something that took me a while to get to, and I want to share with you, and that's that a balanced life doesn't always look like it. It doesn't always look like what I think we think a balanced life should look like, where it's picture perfect, or you're always calm, or everything's always taken care of. That's not at all what my life looks like. Part of creating balance for me has been learning to focus on what matters most in that moment and letting other stuff go. And sometimes that other stuff never gets done, and learning to live with that and work through that. So I share this example. It's a time last summer when we were visiting with some friends at a park with their child and my two children, my husband. And that's my daughter desperately trying to get me to go play with her. And instead, I'm talking to my friend. And I want to share that because I want to be honest and say that for me, creating a balanced life means creating time where I put some of my adult relationships above my children, and some is where I put my work above my children. But there's also times where I put my children above my work or my personal endeavors. And it's all about being really strategic about how I use that time. And I think that's just a great example of, just because I've created a balance that works for me doesn't mean always that everyone around me likes it. And so sometimes you have to stay strong with it, even when your daughter is trying to pull you away. So that's a little bit about me and Create Balance. I want to talk a little bit about the Create Balance method. And it's basically a system for balancing personal, professional, and parenting sides of life. It goes through 3 stages. First is identifying essential values. The second is figuring out live and balance systems and strategies. So getting very concrete about practical things you can do to make your essential values where you spend most of your time and energy. And then there's a reflection component as well, which is crucial. For our workshop today, our webinar today, talking about the reaction and response loop, we're going to be talking about a live and balance system, the reaction response loop, but it does have an element of reflection to it as well. I'm going to be asking you to really think about not just what your reactions are that you want to replace, but also why you have them and what leads up to them, because sometimes the answers can be found more in the beginning, what leads up to them, than in the end. All right, so how do you replace a reaction with a response? Because if it was simple, we'd all be doing it already. So let's talk a little bit about understanding and disrupting the reaction loop. And I want to be clear here. The first thing we're going to have to do here is figure out why is the reaction happening and what's going on there in order to disrupt it. Because to pretend that you can disrupt it just by through willpower or somehow being a magically better person, it's not that simple. If it was that simple, we all would have been doing it, because most of us are doing the best we can. We all are doing the best we can. And so if we want to change how we're reacting now, and just thinking about it harder hasn't been working, we need to disrupt something else. So let's talk about the reaction loop, what it really is. So understanding disrupting the reaction loop. The reaction loop basically looks like this. It's got 3 major parts. There's the cue. So something happens, and then you either have a response or reaction, right? Right now we're assuming you have some kind of reaction that either you can't control or it's harder for you to control when you're exhausted, which for most of us is a lot of the time. And then there's some kind of outcome. There's some kind of result from the reaction. And usually it's not the reaction itself that's a problem. We usually don't like the outcome, and we assume that by changing the reaction, we can change the outcome. So just to break that down a little bit more, the cue is the event or the situation or the feeling that really triggers the reaction, that makes it happen. An example I'll be talking about here is my frustration when my children ask me the same question 15 times after I've already answered it several times. So my cue is usually about time number 10, I start to have the frustration build up. And then there's a response or the reaction, the behavior that you show as a result of the cue. So in my example, when my son asks for the 10th time what we're having for dinner, when I've already told him 8 or 9 times, my reaction, especially at the end of the day, is to get really sarcastic and tell him, just kidding, I guess we're having pepperoni pizza. Like, very sarcastic, which is not super helpful with a very literal child, because then he really thinks I've changed my mind about dinner. So my reaction that I have is to get sarcastic with my child, which is not effective. And the outcome of that is that for a brief moment, I feel a little bit of release of tension, right? Because I got to snap a little bit, but it also just makes it more confusing for my son, and it doesn't actually change the behavior of asking 10 or 15 times. So that's just one example of the response reaction loop. So you can start thinking about maybe what brought you to this webinar today, which reaction you're having that you'd like to change, and start thinking about what are some of the cues that lead up to it. And there can be multiple cues, right? So I'm really not sarcastic with my children in the morning, because in the morning I'm a more functional person. reaction. But after about 5 p.m., my blood sugar is low, I turn into a less functional person. So for me, the cue is both being asked the same question 10 times, but also being hungry or tired or still thinking about work and thinking about stuff that happened at work that day. Those are all part of the cue that lead to my sarcastic reaction. All right, so let's talk about how do you actually use this loop. If you understand it, if you can kind of dissect where you're at, you still need to be able to figure out how to use it. So we're gonna identify the parts. So first off, I actually like to start with the reaction because I think that's the part that most people are familiar with, right? They know what the reaction is. That's why you're watching this video probably. So what is a reaction you're having that is problematic? Is it a reaction you're having to your child? Is it a reaction you're having to a partner or spouse? Is it a reaction that you're having to stress at work or expectations at work? Is it even just a nighttime reaction? I know for me, one thing I always have struggled with is eating at night, mostly because I don't sleep well afterwards. But after about 8 p.m., after the kids are in bed, I start to just want to snack on something, especially if I'm watching TV. And that's sort of a reaction I have that I keep thinking that if I'm just strong enough and have enough willpower, I won't do. But it's not how that works. At 8 p.m., my reaction is to say, can I finally eat some food all by myself and sit on the couch and watch TV? Because that's something that really helps me chill out at the end of the day. So think about what your reaction is now. And then what are the cues that lead up to that reaction? Again, think of multiple cues, right? Is there something another person is doing that's triggering that reaction in you? Is it something a child says or a coworker says or the way an email is worded? Is it also situational? Is it about how hungry or tired you are? Is it about what else you might be thinking about? Is it about how distracted you are? And then what are the outcomes? Good and bad. I think this is really important because a lot of times we think about our reactions, especially if we want to change them, we just think about the bad outcomes. But also it's worth thinking about what are you getting out of it? Because for most of us, we wouldn't be having this reaction if we didn't get something out of it, right? Even if we also have some bad outcomes as well. So when I'm sarcastic with my son, the outcomes, it doesn't really help him. It doesn't really help me in the long run. But man, for about 2 seconds, I feel like a little bit of release of tension after getting to be sarcastic. I get to feel like I let go of a little bit of my anger and frustration. So there is a positive outcome to that in the sense that there is a release of tension. And I have to recognize that if I really want to change my reaction. Because if I have a response that doesn't allow me that same release of tension, it may not work as well for me. So take just about 30 more seconds and think about what your reaction is now, what the cues are that lead to your reaction, and what are some of the outcomes of your reaction, good and bad. Okay, so for step 2, it's time to name what do you want. What would be your intentional response? So if those same cues all happen, what do you wish you would say or do? How do you wish you would respond? And this is a great time to start thinking about what actual words you want to say or what kind of tone you want to have, what you want to do physically, whether it's take a deep breath and relax, whether it's make eye contact with somebody, whether it's to get a different kind of snack, in my late night snacking example. What kind of response would you like to have? And what do you think will be the outcomes for you and others? So if you actually did that response, what do you think the outcomes would be? And you might have evidence to back this up. You might actually say, hey, when I've done this, it's worked really well. So I know what the outcomes are. Or you could say, I've never really tried it, but I feel like it would be good, or it seems like it would be a good idea. I will just share one example for myself. I've learned that one way I can put off late night snacking is by making myself a cup of tea at night and saying that if I'm still hungry after I drink a mug of tea, then I can have a snack. And 90% of the time I'm not hungry and it's fine. And the other 10% of the time I let myself have a snack at night. So I've tried that before and I go back and forth. So I'll have a month where I'm doing that really well. And then I'll have a month where I'm, Girl Scout cookies come out and it's game over. But I do know that the response of making tea instead of eating a snack, I know that that response works for me because I've tried it. On the other hand, patiently telling my son not to ask me something 10 times, I haven't actually tried that. So that would be something I'd want to try out as a response. I think the outcome would be that he might stop, but I'm not totally sure about that. All right, and then it's time to disrupt the loop. And for this stage, I really want you to think as objectively as possible. Think of it less about doing things right or wrong and more about experimenting to see what works. So, first question to think about is, can you change or avoid the cue? If most of your reaction comes because you're tired or hungry, can you eat more snacks? I mean, sometimes it's as basic as that. I've learned for myself that I shouldn't make any big life decisions until I've had at least 2 glasses of water. And that usually helps me feel better 95% of the time. On the other hand, I can't avoid the cues of my children saying annoying things or asking the same question 10 times. That's part of being a parent. So I have to say, okay, sometimes I can change or avoid the cue. Sometimes I can't. Now, if you know you can change or avoid the cue, the answer to that is yes, then do it. I just highly recommend to make a plan to do it. And I say that because most of us are so focused on not reacting a certain way, we actually forget that we could maybe just avoid the situation altogether. There was a stretch of time with both of my children where they would be really mad in the grocery store if I didn't get them something they picked out. And at some point I realized that, oh, if I can just take one of them to the grocery store and not both of them, then we don't have that problem. And so my husband and I were able to rearrange our schedules a little bit for about 6 months, where just one of us would go grocery shopping with one child at a time. And so that way they learned how to do grocery shopping without being whiny and complaining, but we just avoided the cue of both of them being there. And then eventually they were able to be a little bit more functional. So if you can avoid the cue or change the cue, start there. That's an easy fix. If you can't change or avoid the cue though, or can't change all of the cues, you've got a few options. One is to decide on one concrete response. So for my example, with my son asking the same question 10 times, I might say, okay, if he's asked me 10 times, I'm getting ready to be sarcastic. My one concrete response could be to take a deep breath and bend down and make eye contact with him. And then whatever I say, but like that could be a concrete response. Or I could just pick one line I'm going to say, and I'm just going to say, I've already answered that question. And I'm just going to keep saying that calmly. And I'm going to know that even though I want to be sarcastic, the response I'm going to have is to say, I've already answered that question. I've already answered that question. So picking one concrete response that you're going to do, that you want to do instead of that reaction. And then it's all about noticing the cues and then having that response, being really aware of the cues so that you can do the response you planned instead of the reaction that you have been doing up until now. But of course, making it happen is easier said than done. So here are 3 very basic steps that they are basic and they seem basic, but man, are they effective. And so I highly recommend, even if you think you can skip this step, if you've been trying to not react this way for a while and it hasn't been working, I highly recommend using all 3 of these steps. Write down the plan. Write down your one sentence. If it's me, I might say my one sentence is, I've already said that. I've mentioned that already. I've told you that already. Write it down. If my plan is to make tea at night instead of grabbing a snack, I might actually write just the word tea on a Post-it note and stick it on the fridge or on the cabinet in the kitchen. Write down the plan. You can also set up reminders. If you know the cue happens in the evening, excuse me. If you know the cue happens in the evening when you're tired or hungry, set a little reminder on your phone for 5 p.m. just to pop up and say, take a deep breath or whatever it is, just enough to remind you to do the thing that you've said you're going to do. And then finally, celebrate progress. You're not going to be perfect all the time. Nobody is. But when you actually do the response, just take a minute to pat yourself on the back, no matter what the outcome is, because you may not have exactly the outcomes you want. But if you've been able to replace the reaction with the response, first of all, congrats. It takes hard work. And second of all, that means you can play around with different responses until you get the outcomes that you want. All right, so I'm going to share a few examples. I'm going to share, just share a couple examples of understanding and disrupting the reaction loop, and these are real examples from my life, and then we'll go from there. So this first one is from my example of my son asking me the same question over and over and over again and me responding sarcastically. As you can see, step 1 was I identified the parts. Step 2 is I named what I wanted. I wanted to be calm. I wanted to be honest. And I wanted to model naming frustration. I really wanted to be able to have my children understand that grown-ups get frustrated too. And I wanted to model for them how I could be frustrated, but still be kind to people at the same time. So step 3 was to disrupt. My response was to do 3 deep breaths and then make eye contact. Not worry about what I was going to say, but do those 3 things first. And the steps to make it happen, I put a note on the fridge. I wrote down what I wanted to do, put a note on the fridge, because 95% of the time this was happening in the kitchen. For on a professional level, as a teacher, I grade a lot of papers. So I did the same technique to deal with some of the procrastination issues I was having, especially when grades were due at the end of a term. So when I have a stack of papers to grade, like a really big stack, I actually procrastinate more. Like the bigger the stack, the more I mess around with other stuff or do things that don't really need to be done. And the outcome is I just got more and more stressed about the papers. So what I really wanted was a manageable grading load on a weekly basis. That was not going to happen from my job. Like nobody at my job was going to say, oh, we'll take care of those papers for you. So what I had to do to disrupt it is I actually devoided the queue of the stack of papers, and I would only bring 20 papers home to grade at a time. And that worked for me because 20 papers I felt like I could get through. But if I had 40 or 60, it felt overwhelming. I didn't do any of them. So I also set a reminder for myself on my weekly to-do list to just work on those papers. So that was a system that worked for me in my professional capacity. And again, I showed this example through the video, but at night I have a desire to eat, especially sugary things, which does disrupt my sleep quite a bit. It's not just about sugar being bad. It actually makes me a more sleep deprived and therefore more cranky person. So I needed to go to sleep more easily. I needed to have less sugar. And so being able to watch TV, but also drink tea instead of having a sugary treat, that worked. And one of the things that made it happen was I put an alarm on my phone and it just would ring and it would remind me to like, go make tea. Don't go get the Girl Scout cookies. So again, now it's the same way to use the system. So hopefully you've got some ideas for how you can replace your own reactions with responses. I have a few final tips for you. I just want to say that it's really, really important to do just one thing at a time. Just one thing at a time. Don't try and replace 3 things. I shared 3 examples with you today so you could see how it worked in parenting life and professional life and personal life, but you shouldn't do all 3 of those at once. I certainly didn't. You do one at a time. So I'd like you to just take a moment now. What's one reaction you're having with your children or with any other situation that you want to change and that you want to have an intentional response? Start thinking about how you can disrupt that loop and make a change and treat it like an experiment. Be objective and say, I wonder if this is going to work, because nothing has to be perfect. It's always better to try something than nothing. So thank you so much for watching. And again, if you don't already have it, go to createbalancedlife.com and you can check out our resource page, which has all of the strategy sheets, including the reaction to response loop sheet, which is really helpful and has a little worksheet on there that you can actually fill out about your reaction loop and thinking about how to disrupt it. And as always, I love to hear from folks. So you can go to createbalancedlife.com. You can contact me there. You can also find Create Balance on Facebook and Twitter, and I love interacting with folks. So please feel free to drop me a line or say hi or follow from there. Thank you so much for your time.